efficient of everyone's time. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you. My name is Renuka Srinivasan, and on behalf of Clinical Trials Ontario, we are presenting this month's Research Ready Mentor Spotlight. The Mentor Spotlight series is a monthly webinar where an expert shares best practices and highlights exceptional processes relevant to the clinical research community in Ontario and Canada. We aim to be interactive in the live sessions, but we also post a recording of the webinar at the link you see here on the slide. For more information on Research Ready, you can always visit CTO's website. We also provide a certificate of attendance for those who join the live session and would like a record for CE purposes. We just ask attendees to complete a short feedback survey that will appear on your screen at the end of the webinar. We welcome any feedback you have or suggestions on topics or speakers you would like to see at future sessions. You can share your feedback through the survey itself or by contacting us. Just a few housekeeping notes. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so at that time, feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat feature as well. So today we welcome our speaker, Heather Cole. Heather is the Senior Manager of Operations at the Princess Margaret Cancer Centre in the Cancer Clinical Research Unit, which is a central CRU within UHN. Heather oversees metrics and operational reporting across the program, patient and partner initiatives, manages key clinical research IT systems, a data safety monitoring board, and she oversees the quality and approval process for all new studies within the program. This operational portfolio supports over 200 investigators and 500 staff, with more than 150 new clinical trials being activated each year. In addition to her initiatives and committees for population research, and she's an agent of continuous process improvement. Heather graduated from McGill University and has worked in cancer clinical research for almost 20 years in various progressive roles. And in this Mentor Spotlight session, she will share her expertise on how to develop a metrics program and the use of metrics to drive process optimization. So with that, I will pass it over to Heather.
Perfect. Thank you, Renuka. Okay, let's do a switch of the shared screens in 2 seconds. Okay, perfect. Can everybody see? Just want to make sure that we're good. Awesome. Okay. So thank you, Renuka, for that introduction. That's wonderful. I'm just going to briefly turn my video off while we're doing this, largely because I'm going to be honest, I have speaker notes off to the side and you guys are going to get a lovely view of my profile if I keep it on, but I will be turning it back on at the time of the Q&A. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so I am going to be talking to you about metrics. Okay, so as Renuka said, I work with the Cancer Clinical Research Unit at Princess Margaret, and metrics is a large part of my portfolio. It was one of the first things added to my portfolio, and I'm really happy to be here today to share our experience and hopefully address some of the feedback that has been shared with CTO about what learners would like to know more about metrics. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about, obviously, metrics. I'm going to review the foundation of how to start a metrics program. So it's really going to be from that lens of just starting out. We're going to touch again, sort of as the description said, on the who, what, where, when, why, and how of how a program can be established. I'm going to share some of our early lessons learned and some of the lessons that we learned along the way of really how to ensure success. And at the end, I'm also going to take some time to highlight some of the metrics that we use both for promotional work and some of the examples of where we used it to improve process and drive change. Okay. And by the way, this is an interactive session. So during the talk, you're going to see this type of a slide pop up, which means we're coming into the interactive part. There's going to be times where I ask you guys questions or inquire about your feedback, just to make sure that everybody doesn't have too much of that post-lunch, I need a siesta. Keep everyone on their toes for the session. Okay, question number 1. And in order to use this, if you haven't done it before, you can either log into Menti and enter in the code, or you can just open up your smartphone, zoom in on that QR code, click on it, and you'll be brought right to this area. You'll actually be able to see the slides as I go through as well. It'll sort of automatically push you through as we move forward. Okay, so starting now, do you currently use metrics in your program? Okay. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to hit pause right there. Oh, we still have a couple coming in. That's awesome. So very quick countdown. And we are going to give 10 more seconds, not even. And then we're going to close the voting and keep on going. Cast your ballots now. Awesome. Okay, so that's helpful. So what this helps show me is that, we obviously have a group of people who currently aren't using metrics. And so that foundational information will be very helpful. And then we also have some seasoned group staff and people in the presentation who currently are using metrics and can sort of see where some of the areas that we've been using them and see if that can work for their center or program too. Okay. So one thing I do want to touch on is sort of what are metrics. Now, I think that obviously the talk here is about how to establish a metrics program, but also what we're going to be looking into is the fact that that metrics program becomes the backbone if you are moving into KPIs or leaning into benchmarking. And I want to go over just briefly what each one of these are. Okay, so when we're looking at metrics, we're looking at something that is quantifiable. So it is something that is numeric, it's reliable, meaning it's something that we are able to trust the data that we are seeing. We are able to repeat that data multiple times, and we're going to come out with the same outcome if we follow the same process. It's something that's relevant, so it's meaningful to what it is that we are looking at. It's not just a number for a number's sake. It is something that we can clearly define, meaning, and that also helps make it reliable and reproducible. It's also something that then we could share with other parties in order for them to do exactly the same thing. And they are something that we use to track performance. So it's really an area for us to be able to see how are we doing and just better understand our business overall. The other phrase that people hear a lot about are KPIs, or key performance indicators, and sometimes these are used interchangeably. But when we're leaning into a KPI, it's when we're actually tracking performance, but against set goals. So it's similar to metrics, but in this case, we're actually looking at it relative to a specific goal that our program or organization has set. And they also tend to be a smaller number that we're looking at. So while you may be able to collect, 30 different metrics, you may only be looking at 4 or 5 KPIs. Now, and behind each KPI, though, there could be multiple metrics that sort of help you just determine how you are staying on track or areas that you need to change in order to achieve that KPI. The other one that we tend to learn about is benchmarking. And benchmarking is really when we have that external standard that we are now trying to compare ourselves against. Now, unlike KPIs and metrics, benchmarking can be both qualitative or quantitative, but it still fulfills the requirements of being something that's reliable, relevant, and defined. Okay, and that's really sort of when we're talking about metrics, often these terms all come into play when we're looking at metrics, KPIs, and benchmarking. Okay. Okay, here's our fun little interactive session again. Don't worry, they're not normally this close together. So, and this is really for you guys to put in your opinion, okay? Why do you think we look at metrics? Well, I like it for fun. Awesome. Okay, gonna get ready to start a countdown. Amazing. Okay, so you can see right here that the most common thing that people pointed out to was performance, closely followed by process improvement, quality improvement, and knowledge. Okay, and those are great answers. There's lots of really, really good input in here about why we look at metrics. Okay. Awesome. Okay, and here's sort of the recap of it. So those were great ideas, everybody. Okay, so often when I'm looking at, why do we look at metrics, I tend to break it into sort of that internal and external reasons. Okay, so when we're looking at those internal reasons, it's really going to be the value add to your own program. So why are we looking at our own metrics? Okay, and when we're looking at external reasons, it's really going to be the value add to our program by sharing our metrics beyond our walls. So when we're looking at the internal benefit, a lot of it does start with sort of we're just curious. We start with that wanting to understand our business better. Some of it's going to be for fun. There's that question or, that inkling of like, I wonder about, and then we start looking into it and we start to get that broader understanding of what's happening within our own program. And one common one could be things like, how many clinical trials did we open last year? Okay, that's a very common one where people do tend to start out. And that gives us something to start looking into. Now, over time, we might want to start to measure our performance by looking at the number of clinical trials that we open each year. And that's another internal thing. So how does our operations change year to year? Is our volume going up or down? Is our workload going up or down? And how do we end up managing that? And then in the process of that, we start moving through that concept of internal process review, using the metrics to better understand our internal processes. It's one thing to say that it takes us, 60 days to open up a clinical trial. It's another thing to be able to look at the different pieces within that process to see what we could change to make that better. And that's where we get into that process improvement. So that's a huge part of looking at internal metrics and something that people did comment on the Mentimeter just before. And ultimately what this all can drive at, again, is supporting those KPIs, those key performance indicators that we define as a program or an organization that ultimately we're going to be using this measurement and review of metrics in order to drive change to achieve those KPIs. Okay. When we start looking at that external part, benchmarking is a huge, huge piece of it, something that's a little bit harder in the clinical trials realm because there isn't that much data external that's broadly available for people to be able to benchmark against. But there's always that desire to sort of say, well, how are we doing compared to other guys? Are we having the same challenges or the same, accomplishments as they are? Are there things that we can learn from each other? And I think that's a wonderful place where metrics do come in and the ability to share knowledge so that we all improve. But the other huge external piece is promotion, promotion, promotion. And this is an area where I will say that as our metrics program has become around longer, is something that is used more and more frequently within Princess Margaret, where those metrics are being requested to help promote the work that we're doing, whether it be to other organizations to help them lead change, for our foundation, to our sponsors, and really making sure that we get the wonderful work that our teams are doing out to everybody else so that they're aware of it. And you can't promote your business if you don't know what it is. Okay. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a flavor of what are metrics and why we like to collect them. Now we're going to talk a little bit for how to set up a metrics program. Now it sounds like some of you already have metrics that you guys are using, so some of this may have already been established, but for those people on the call that might be new to metrics and are really just starting out in this area, this is sort of the cycle that you can go through to start to put together a metrics program. Okay, and as you can see, it is a circle, which means that this is an iterative process. So we might start at evaluate and work our way all the way through to initiate a metrics program, but the program is going to keep growing and changing over time. And you're going to keep going through this cycle iteratively, continuously. We still go through it right now at Princess Margaret, and we've been sort of managing our metrics since about 2008. Okay. So at the very beginning, starting with evaluate. So one of the tips that I'm going to provide is that we're surrounded by data. There is data everywhere. It may not be something that we're always thinking about as being metrics or something that we're thinking about how we could use it to help with performance reporting, but the data that we have around us is very plentiful. So one of the best places to start if you're wanting to put together a metrics reporting is think about what's already there. What is it that we're already doing? What are we already putting into a spreadsheet or submitting to a sponsor? Is there a way for us to harness the data that's already available to us? It's not uncommon for coordinators to have business trackers where they're going to put in the date they submitted something to the REB, or maybe when the REB approved it or sent their letters back. All of that can get turned into metrics if your tracker is set up the right way. Okay, so looking at some of those practices already there really make things tangible and easily obtainable. Now, we might also have things that we want that may not quite be available, but they might be easily attainable. Are there things where we can lean in on other departments to get their support? Are there places that we can get data linkage? Are there little changes to workflows that suddenly will make something available that wasn't before? And I'll talk a little bit about places where we had done those tweaks in workflows in order to help build out the Princess Margaret Metrics program with limited impact on our study coordinators, which was something that was very important to us. Okay. So starting that initial assessment and that, very much an environmental scan of what's already around you. Okay. Next thing, so you've kind of done that environmental scan. You know that there's a bunch of data being collected in different places. You know there's some things that maybe your coordinators are already collecting, but we haven't really thought about them as being metrics. We've just thought about it as being a tracker. So this is where we sit down and we start thinking about what do we need more about? What do we need to know more about? So really thinking through those must-haves, okay? One of the, we'll get into lessons learned later, but one of them is, sometimes start small to grow big. If you start with 100 metrics that you're going to want to track, eventually something's going to fall off and people are going to get overwhelmed and they're going to stop doing it. But if you start with a couple of those really critical must-haves, it's something that's much more tangible and doable for everybody, and you're going to see success faster, and then you get buy-in to keep going, okay? So while we're looking at what we want to know more about, what our must-haves are, we also can start thinking about what maybe would we like to know more about in a little bit. So again, those areas where we can start looking at establishing the processes to collect the data by making those tweaks, okay? And then also thinking through our stakeholders and talking to them. So one thing you'll start to realize when you are collecting metrics or looking at them, even for your internal business processes, is that other people are going to start to become aware of it and they're going to ask for them. So understanding what the needs are of the different departments, your PIs, administration, foundation, sponsors is really helpful, because that might help you focus on what metrics to go after first, okay? Some of the most common ones are always going to be accrual, volume of studies, and time to open. Those are probably your three most common metrics that people are going to be interested in. Now, how you slice and dice them, that could be something that is unique. Each organization is going to have a slightly different flow or needs that they would like to know more about. It might be that they all report to one department. It could be you have different departments or site groups. So understanding some of that organizational structure will also help you determine how best to obtain and track your metrics so that you can provide meaningful data back to the people that need to use it. Okay, and here's a great case example. So this is right off of our foundation's website. Okay, so this is again when we're looking at our stakeholders. Our foundation is a huge stakeholder in our metrics program. They regularly are reaching out to obtain real world data to help them with their goals of fundraising. And on their website, they do have a blurb about clinical trials at Princess Margaret for our donors. And when we actually take a closer look at that blurb, which looks like a whole lot of text, what we actually see is tucked in here is a whole lot of metrics. So these are areas where they've come to CCRU to sort of get more specific information so that they can incorporate it into their own marketing to help bring increased funding into the hospital to support our academic research. So this is a place where these metrics are very valuable. Okay. Okay, everybody, thinking caps on. I want you to say, how would you measure time to open? If you were asked, please provide your time to open, what would be your start and your stop of that question? Might need the Jeopardy music. I can see we have some UHN folks on here. Okay, I'm going to give the countdown. I'm just going to start scrolling. Awesome. Okay. 24 answers. Beautiful. Okay. And I'm going to take a quick moment. So very common metric that we get asked for in clinical trials. What is your time to open? I think every sponsor is going to come to the site and say, can you please tell us your approximate time to open so that they can anticipate when we can start putting patients onto a clinical trial. You'll also hear sites, on different chat platforms or looking at process improvement across their sites to say, what's your time to open? And really trying to be able to benchmark themselves against other centers in order to see what they could be doing differently in order to achieve that coveted fastest time to open, okay? But here's a great example of what we end up seeing is that just by saying that phrase, time to open, we have This is from the receipt of the request to first patient. So that's one person's definition of time to open. Okay. Here we have from the site qualification to SIV. So that would be a very long time to open. Similar to this one, site selection to activation. Okay. Here we have from protocol received to final institutional approval. Okay. Here we have, again, protocol to SIV. So a little bit different than institutional approval. Here we have from the startup package to site ready. Okay. Here we have this thing called the full regulatory package. And even if you start asking people what that full regulatory package is, you're going to get different answers. For some people, it might be every document. For other teams, it may end up being just the protocol plus laboratory and imaging manuals. So even in something as simple as measure your time to open, what we end up seeing is there's a lot of variability and heterogeneity when this question is put out there. So just something to keep in mind when you start hearing people talking about their numbers and looking at that benchmarking. And that's why this part is so important, okay? Critical part of setting up a metrics program, define. You need to make sure that you have very clear definitions of your specific data points and your exact data calculations and where the data is coming from, okay? Because each person is going to have a slightly different interpretation of a number of these data points. Some are a lot more straightforward, first accrual. Okay, but I'm presuming that's an enrollment date. But what if there's pre-screening? Does that count? And looking at some of those parties and pieces. Okay, so really, really making sure that everybody has a very good data dictionary that they're creating for their metrics program that defines the specifics of their data points, how they're doing the calculations. And when we start actually looking at those performance measures, what we are measuring against, because over time we will start to forget if we're just basing it upon our own memory for what our targets were. Okay. And clear documentation of these practices. One other area that's very important to consider is including the date of implementation. When did you start collecting that metric? It might seem a little bit odd at the outset to do that because you're like, well, we started today. But when you start getting 5, 6, 7, 8 years in, people will want to have that retrospective review to see that progress over time, which means you're going to want to have an understanding about what point did we start using that metric, when did we deem that metric to now be reliable and not just data that was available, and making sure that you have an understanding of that within your own program. Okay. Okay, so you've taken the time to figure out what you have, you know what you need, and you have defined your needs, and now you're getting ready to collect, okay? When you're getting ready to start collecting those metrics, again, you're going to need to think about where is it going to be stored. Large part of this is really going to come down to the size of your program, how many people need to access it. Do you need a web system to be able to do this? Is an Excel file going to be okay? Okay, so there's going to be different needs really based upon your program and your size. We do have a web-based tool that we use, and then we incorporate metrics into them, and then that feeds to other systems. So that's where we are right now, and it's quite helpful, but that doesn't mean that everybody needs something that's quite that, I'm not going to say fancy, but fancy. The other part of collecting, and I said this earlier as well, is start simple. So pick those things that are attainable and have a high value output. You want those easy wins at the beginning. You want people to buy into providing their data and knowing that that data adds value both to their work and to the organization as a whole. And the other thing you're going to want to do as you start seeing data come through is hit pause. So make sure that you look at it and make sure it makes sense. So even before we get to the broader sharing of the information, do that type of reflection as the content expert to make sure that the data you're seeing is what you would expect. And if it's not what you would expect, then dig in a little bit to figure out, now, is it not what I expect because something has gone wrong in the collection? Or is it not what I expect because sometimes there's surprises, and that's okay too. But make sure you do that holistic review and that you're comfortable with the data that is actually being produced and you're confident in sharing it. Okay, and when we're looking at the collection, there's a couple of different processes here. So I can talk a little bit about, who does the collection within the cancer program at Princess Margaret. We have joint effort. So we do actually centralize like the study build in our database is done by my team. So that's something that we support operationally within CCRU. And then our study teams, they actually associate their patients into the database. That's done by our frontline coordinators. And once a study is open, our regulatory coordinators will maintain the study information in the database. So we kind of have a three-way, team effort to keep the data up to date and to allow the metrics program to succeed. But dividing the work is definitely helpful when you've got a very large program. Okay. And this last piece, review. So again, taking that time, not just to think, does the data make sense, but completing a quality review, checking in to see, did you get what you were expecting? When we first started collecting accrual data, we would email to the different study teams to ask them for just an email of the number of patients they put on trial in the past year and double check against the database. And then when we would see gaps, we would help do that re-education and help people understand why it's important to put the patients into the system and the value add. We also looked at the process to see if there was anything that we could do differently to make it a bit easier for the staff, why was there delays in completion, et cetera. You're going to want to review whether or not the metrics are actually meeting your objectives. They do take time, so if it's not something that's adding value, it may not be something that you want to keep collecting. And you may identify areas where you actually now realize there's something you're missing and you would like to know more about. So really growing out, again, that list of metrics that you're collecting in order to keep meeting the needs of the program. And the other thing, especially as technology changes, business process changes, teams change, is there an easier or better way to collect the metrics? So again, as I said, this is an iterative approach. So this is not something we just do once. We're continuously reassessing to say, is there another way to do this and have better quality? Or save time in what it is that we're trying to achieve. Okay, and last but not least, promote. So often metrics are a contribution by multiple people. It's often a reflection of the work being done by our study team. So making sure that we do share that data, we promote the work that's being done. Things that we do well, we sell it, we make sure people are aware of it. And we also make sure that we continuously reflect as a team on what we could do better. We often use our metrics to drive group change. So when you're looking at data across programs, you're able to actually see sort of common areas of process improvement or areas where we can sort of help add support to groups. When you're looking at them just one by one, you may not always see those patterns. Okay. And again, if we're starting to implement those change initiatives across the program, using those same metrics to really evaluate the success of the different changes that we are bringing in that land process improvement. Okay. Other things to consider as you're kicking off. Database, so we spoke a little bit about where you put that data. So again, considering the size of your program, ease of entry and access, do you only need one person to get in? Do you need multiple people in at the same time? That can make a huge difference. Typically, if people have carved out time to provide information and they can't get into a system, you can't guarantee they're going to double back in a timely fashion. So really understand sort of the workflows and expectations there and that the system will support it properly. Making sure that you have a plan in place for what's going to happen if people want to use the data beyond just your internal operational review. What happens the first time somebody asks you whether or not they can use that data for a research study? Okay, we've definitely had it where people are doing retrospective research studies and they're going to be asking for a list of studies or volumes of patients or characteristics of patients, and knowing that we have a process in place to allow those types of requests is very important. Administrative requests by specific departments is another area, okay? And just anticipating that increased workload that could be coming through. And here's a really important one. Who's going to be responsible for the data? And I don't mean entering it. That's obviously one of the considerations that, again, will fit a little bit more depending on different team structures and flows. But you need somebody who's going to take on that role of being the data steward. Okay, the person who's going to make sure the documentation is done, that the definitions are down, that we have that record keeping of all the different data that we're collecting from where, when, how, and also that person who is the most knowledgeable of the different data points and help guide people that when they do have a business question, which data points they should actually be going after to best answer that question. Okay, so really that go-to person that oversees the use and the quality of that data. Okay, and this is just a recap of the how to set up a metrics program. So again, starting with evaluate what's already available, defining your objectives, what you need and what you want, okay, and creating a plan for what you want, defining and making sure that everything that you're defining allows for consistent and reproducible metrics, starting the collection process, keeping it simple to start in order to get buy-in and really to test your methods, reviewing how things went, making sure that, again, the data was reliable, the accuracy is there, your objectives are being met, and make any changes or tweaks that are needed. And then really starting to promote those metrics that you have been collecting, promote the great plan for improvements, and then keep reassessing. Okay, it's been a while. Are you ready? Okay. What metric do you think would be the most important to your site and or company? What would help you guys the most? Do, 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 do. Oh, I can see a bunch of people are getting ready to respond. Okay, I'm going to close this out right now. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to start the countdown. Get your votes in. Beautiful. Okay. So really common one. So you can see it right there. Accrual. It is probably one of the most common metrics that we are ever asked for. You can see that echoed again in number of participants. Target versus accrual, fantastic. So really looking at, again, are we actually delivering on what we promised? Time to activation, volume of studies open, number of active studies, so very similar. Site versus sponsor response. So I guess that's potentially looking at time to respond between the two. REB approval timelines. Okay, so you can see this really does have sort of common themes if you're looking at it. So when we say start simple, I think even by looking at this, you can see the most common things that people probably need. Volume of patients, volume of studies, timelines, okay? And then really looking at those types of things. You can also see that some of those other things that can be helpful, metrics that show GCP. So looking at our training commitment, are we actually delivering on our training? How many of our staff have completed their GCP training? Okay. Looking at eligible patient population. So things that can sort of help, again, identify that very fun question we always get on feasibility, which is what are the volume of patients that we may see with specific characteristics. Looking at, here's a great one, where was the grant success? Grant success, so very common within research administration to want to know that rate of grant success or the amount of funding brought in through various grants. Okay, so these are great examples of very common metrics that are used both within clinical research and within research administration as a whole. Okay, lessons learned. Okay, so we're really kicking it back to when we first started our metrics program. And one of the first lessons we had to go through was actually just trying to get the data. Okay, so when we first started, we did have, again, a very straightforward web tool where we had built out our studies. At that point in time, our REB submissions were on paper. I know paper, it's so crazy to think about. And then we had this IT system, and then we had managed to have within our medical records system sort of a link to the IT system that it made it look like it was in our medical record system, but it was actually just sitting outside. And the whole ask to our study teams was, can you please add your studies to the database when they are REB approved? And then can you link your patients in the medical record system to your study? Okay, so that was really what we were looking at to initiate the understanding of our volume of patients and volume of new studies. Now, when we started to, launch this process and we looked at, getting that information about the accruals, the number of patients, what we started to realize is that there were a lot of gaps in entering in the patients or entering the patients in a timely fashion. So we started meeting with groups to better understand the why, and a lot of it's just coming down to workflow and workload. So when we started to look at some of that, we're like, okay, well, let's at least start by maybe we can take over the entry of the studies. So we're going to build a relationship with our REBs so that we have a sense of, how many studies are actually coming into the program or how many are being submitted to full board. So we sort of had a rough idea of what to expect. And then we started looking at some of the other workflows already in the program. Namely, it was like our impact assessment process for clinical impact. And we just said to the teams, when you submit your impact assessment form, just attach your REB application. Okay, so they already had to submit the impact assessment form. That was nothing new. And the one change was, can you please attach a document you've already completed? And we would take the information from those two tools and we actually would build out the studies on behalf of the team. So at least that way, we were getting them into the database and taking that work away from our coordinators. And that gave us a better understanding of the actual studies that were in the program. It also meant that we could start working towards standardization of how the data got entered, meaning it was more reliable when we went to go do the data pulls. Okay. And then it made it a bit easier when it came time for the staff to link their patients because their studies were always there. To help with some of the timeliness of the entry of patients, we had the system set up so that it could produce the enrollment log electronically from the system. So as long as you linked your patient, you just hit produce enrollment log, and it would give you a log of all of the patients on study with their medical record number, date of enrollment, study number, everything you needed in your enrollment log. And that way staff were able to give up maintaining their enrollment log on tongue-tied here, enrollment log on a paper-based process and move to the electronic process. So it was a trade-off in work. So stop doing one and start doing the other. And that way the net workload was neutral for staff members. Okay. So this was really some of our early lessons, was that we realized that when we downloaded more and more to the coordinators, often they were very busy to try to do everything. So being able to centralize some of the tasks and then integrate other ones directly into workflows that were already there and trying to keep that workload net neutral helped aim for success. Okay. Oh, this one cut off at the top. Sorry about this, guys. Okay. Another early lesson learned: expect the unexpected and share shamelessly. So when we first started looking at our timelines, we had sat down with our startup teams at the time to map out the workflows. And we had the data about, how long does it take to go through Health Canada in times where it's an IIT? How long does it take to get our contracts on average? How long does it take to get through REB? And how long does it take to get through clinical impact assessment? And when we looked at the three, all of which were designed, or actually it's 4 processes designed to run in parallel, we were sort of expecting it to be a certain number of days to get all the way through to activation. And when we looked at the actual activation timelines, it was far greater than the longest process, which didn't really make sense for something that was designed to run fully in parallel. So we sat down and actually looked to see what was happening. And when we met with everybody to ask about why do you think it takes so long to open, it was, well, it's contracts or it's REB. And when we actually went to go look at the data, we realized something, that it wasn't contracts or REB, but it was us. So it ended up being that most of the time, even though the processes were designed to be submitted in parallel and reviewed in parallel, because of workload, they were being submitted sequentially, which means that we were really losing that edge of having everything set up and designed to run in parallel. So this was data that we ended up sharing with our managers. We shared it with staff involved in study startup. And just in the process of sharing the data and making no additional changes, within the next year, we saw a 32% improvement in startup times. And we saw those 2 graphs now come close together. So being able to share shamelessly meant that it actually drove process change because people were now aware of where the gap was and they were happy to act on trying to change it themselves. Okay. This was a later lesson learned, and this is what I refer to as integration. So another place where we've been able to get buy-in to help ensure the success of the metrics program is we started integrating the database that gets maintained within other systems at UHN. And a great example is that our trials are publicly posted on our website. There is a database there that patients or caregivers or other clinicians can search to see which trials are currently open to recruitment. This happens seamlessly within our database. When we build out the study for the study teams, we have the NCT number. Study teams maintain when they flip between open and closed to accrual. And just by toggling that switch, it will automatically either put the study onto the website or take it off. So there's actually just an integration in the background between the data feed from clinicaltrials.gov with our internal recruitment status and our internal PI. And that allows the studies to be displayed in real time without anybody filling in an extra form or having to request to have it added. They just continue with their workflows and they're there. Okay. And here's another lesson learned. Okay, so I want everyone to look at this picture. So right here, what we are showing is a representation of the percentage of treated patients enrolled on a clinical trial at Princess Margaret. This is from a couple of years ago. And I want you to think about what you're seeing. So again, those little turquoise people are the percentage enrolled. Okay, and then all the gray people are not enrolled. Okay, and then using Mentimeter, I want you to vote on what you think about our proportion of enrollment on clinical trials. Or is it good or not so good? Okay, and I'm going to start the countdown a little bit sooner, just being cognizant of time. Okay, so you know what, almost 50-50. So, thank you for everybody who said that was good proportional accrual. Okay, but what you're going to see is, again, still the majority kind of look at that graph and say, not so stellar. Okay, and I want you to remember that because we're going to go to the next slide. Okay, now I want you to look at this graph. Now, this is also Princess Margaret's proportional accrual of patients treated on clinical trial. Okay, now looking at this graph, same question. When you see that graph, does it make it look like we have good proportional accrual or not so good? Okay, I'm going to start that countdown. I think we can see where this is going. Awesome. Okay, perfect. So you can see universally, this graph, everybody looked at that graph and said, you have good proportional accrual. This is my next lesson. It's what's referred to as the art of data. So the more data you start producing, there can be literally thousands of numbers sitting in front of you. So really taking some thought about the message that you're wanting to convey to other people, learning and taking that time to figure out how to best distill that data down into something that is simple is incredibly important, because the way that you present that data is going to change the message that somebody else gets from it, okay? Nobody wants to sit there and go through an Excel spreadsheet looking at hundreds of data points in order to get to the take-home message. They want something that's in front of them that could be using infographics, it could be using graphs, it could be using images, something that really helps them understand what is the take-home message of that data. Okay, I can tell you behind every slide that I do, it is generally hours of work for something that looks simple, but that's the goal, is to make it simple for other people. Okay, so the art of the data. Okay, so now we get into the case examples. So again, I've kind of given some of our case examples and lessons learned throughout this talk. Right now, I'm going to actually show some of the slides that we use currently, some of our promotional materials, and then some of the business cases where we've been sort of reviewing our numbers and ones that we use frequently and that have been very valuable to our program. So this is our PM experience. Okay, so this is our intro slide. So this is a slide that we use whenever we are giving, talks to internal or external stakeholders. On the slide, we're able to cover off a lot of different metrics in one single area. And in here, we actually have contributions coming from both our study teams. So it's going to be our frontline coordinators that are, again, entering those clinical trial accruals and the number of patients approached. That's all coming out of EPIC right now. Our new clinical trials activated are based upon our central submission system. So we do have access to our internal review system, and we can see all of the trials coming into the program. And then our study teams do notify us at activation because we actually set up their record in EPIC for them. Okay, so we do that workload. Same for scope, that's coming out of that central review system because we can see all of the different submissions, not just oncology. Our correlatives team track the work that they do. They need to track it to help with supporting their staffing, invoicing, et cetera. So we're able to use that data to be able to have an understanding of the volume of samples that are being managed. And they do have a kit order team where they actually, again, there's like an online web system where they can track the kits that are ordered from them every single year. And this really helps to sort of show that teamwork in behind some of the metrics that we're reporting and the different places that we're pulling from. Okay, when we're looking at volume of staff that are hired, much like many programs, we do have things like SOPs and a SharePoint site and different things that our staff coming in need to get linked into in order to succeed, even if they're not working directly for CCRU. And so when staff are making those requests, they're tracked, okay, by our onboarding support staff. And then we're able to actually look at that volume to figure out how many research staff came into the program in the course of a calendar year. Okay, and that's just sort of, again, some of those areas where we integrate workflows for things that people are already doing, and then we're able to use the metrics out of the background. Okay, other common promotional slide. Now, this one would be a good example of benchmarking. This is percentage of patients enrolled on a clinical trial. So you can see Princess Margaret at the bottom, and then looking at Ontario, Canada, US, and the UK. The other bars outside of Princess Margaret, they don't update annually. So that's one thing that's always a caveat. and really understanding how they do their calculations is also important. There is some variability when we're looking at percentage enrolled. Princess Margaret, we've been able to do it both ways, which is meaning that we look at it over total treated or over total new or incident cases, and we end up with very similar numbers, generally off by a percentage point. But being able to show the volume of patients that come into your organization that you put onto clinical trials is incredibly valuable. Okay, here's another area where we tuck metrics into some of our promotional slides. This is where we talk about sort of the services and operations that we have within our program. And in here, we actually tie in, you can see all those little blue areas, metrics throughout our promotional deck. Okay, and this is an example of where we're able to tuck them in without it being a bar graph everywhere. They're just little numbers that give people a sense of the volume and breadth of the different teams. Okay, and same for our operations. Okay, and here's another one for promotional. So when we have the ability to track accrual over time, you know, we do have the ability to give those big numbers when we're looking at 10-year intervals of the total number of patients that have benefited from being on a clinical trial. Okay, so outside of promotion, we also like to understand our program. So again, that was one of those reasons for collecting metrics, is just to have an understanding of your program overall. So here's a good example where we're looking at sort of that breakdown of the different funding and sponsor models coming into the program for our new activations. So being able to break things down by academic, and that could be IIT or cases where we are serving as a site for another academic project, our industry initiated projects, and our intergroup. And then being able to correlate that back as well to clinical trial accrual. And this is not uncommon for us, where we see we have a lot more academic accrual than we do new academic studies or industry studies. Much like many people, when we dig into this, we start to realize that we put a small number of patients onto a large number of industry studies, largely due to molecular profiling and needing those exact matches. Okay, and another area for understanding our business operations is really looking at that workload being carried by our study teams, the workload being carried by our different disease site groups. So that's sort of reflective of our physicians and our data and regulatory coordinator teams, and the amount of studies that are currently pending, waiting to come into the program. Excuse me. So having that awareness of the volume that is coming and making sure that we are prepared for that workload coming in down the pipe. So again, understanding our business operations. Okay, so here's a case where, again, we were understanding our business operations in order to drive change. This was something we had reviewed a couple of years ago, and we really wanted to better understand the impact of delayed time to open on total recruitment. Okay, and sure enough, you know, as one would expect, that when we have a longer time to open, we do have a delay in the we do have a smaller number of patients that we ultimately recruit. Now, many people were under the assumption that that was because we weren't open as long if we do not activate as fast, and that wasn't always the case. So we found in a number of situations we were open for recruitment just as long as we would have been otherwise. But the longer that we are waiting to activate a trial, often the enthusiasm starts to decline, and then that whole entire go out and get them, you know, that falls off when we have delays there. So really focusing a little bit on the tangible data about why it's so important to activate quickly, even in cases where the study isn't, you know, about to close any moment, is still really, really relevant to overall recruitment. Okay, and this is something that was used by UHN and is really helping sort of drive some of the strategic changes that they have been working on over the past couple of years. Okay. Here's another case of where we actually used it actively at a business operations level during COVID. During COVID, and I think we all felt this, there was the immediate shutdown of research. Working in a cancer program, we had limited opportunity to continue to put select patients onto clinical trials, but we still needed to see a marked reduction in activity. And that was more out of necessity for care. We did look at our clinical research and clinical trial activity week by week. You can definitely see where COVID happened. It was this big plunge straight down. And what this was able to show us was that our teams were very compliant at stopping their clinical research activity. Okay. And we did see that plunge in clinical trial activity, and definitely a lot lower than what would have been our baseline throughout that realm. And you can gradually see that beginning of the reopening as our clinical trial and clinical research numbers started to creep back up. We also wanted to make sure that we were able to assess the general health of the program and the impact of COVID overall. So we were able to look at our cumulative clinical trial accrual from 2019, that's that blue line, before COVID hit, and then look at it during 2020, which was our COVID year. and then the recovery, which was that red line. And we ended up exceeding actually our 2019 when we got to 2021. So we were able to demonstrate our recovery from COVID and that we were back on track. And there were strategic initiatives put into place as we started to reopen to make sure that we were able to recoup some of that volume and continue to support our patients. So this was demonstration that it was working. Okay. Sponsors. So this is another area where we do use it. We work with our sponsors closely. We have a number of preferred partnerships, and it's not uncommon that a sponsor might come and say, you guys are slow, you're fast, they're going to give you a sense of where they feel that you fit relative to other sites. One of the areas we're able to use our metrics is do the same thing, but give our sponsors insight into where they fit relative to our other sponsors. So here's a sponsor that we recently met with, and we were able to pull our top 10 sponsors that we work with and give them a sense of where they are sitting, both looking at volume of new activations, looking at the timelines for average time to authorization and activation. We look at both because activation generally will incorporate things like those multiple amendments that may happen before we're allowed to open versus activation, which does not. Okay. We were able to give them a breakdown also of the current portfolio that we're supporting for them above and beyond just the studies that happened recently. And we were able to give them an idea of their recruitment. Okay. So really looking at the accrual for that sponsor specifically, but also again relative to that, showing them, I guess, the value add that they have by working with us and the contribution that we are giving them relative to the other sponsors. Obviously, here where one was substantially lower than the others that were in a comparable area, that would open up that conversation to better understand the why. But they find this incredibly valuable because they don't often see their competitors' numbers. We do de-identify everything, as you can see, so we don't actually tell a sponsor who the other sponsors are, but they do get to know where they sit relative to the other top 10. Okay. And even though we are a program that has been around for a while, we're still growing too. So future directions that we're looking at right now is sort of implementation of a dashboard. So really trying to give the data back to our study teams and let them be able to look at their own information, pull their own information, et cetera. And also looking at the beginning of the collection of EDI data. So really making sure that we have a stronger understanding of our demographics for all of the clinical trial patients that we recruit. This is the type of example where this is data we often put into databases, but not necessarily something that we have at the medical record level. So this is an area that we're changing for our trial patients. And we're looking forward to seeing some of that to make sure that we are continuing to support all of our patients on clinical trials and access to care. And special thank you to everyone for listening. So I know it was a lot. Members of my team who really make all of this possible. My dog barking in the background, and this wonderful group that I work with. And then for any questions, you can either provide them as verbal, but if you really liked Mentimeter, then you can also put them up there and we can address them. I think we are at time, but I don't know, Renuka, if we have like 5 or what's the best option here.
I mean, we are at time. If you want to stay online for just a minute or two, if anybody has any questions, just as we wrap up. I didn't see anything come through the chat. No. If you're willing to stay on for just another minute or two, we can open it up and feel free to unmute if you have any questions. Yeah.
If not, I am heather.cole@uhn.ca. You're always welcome to email if you have questions. Oh, 1 second, there's chat.
Yeah, we got some feedback from Antella. Heather, this was an outstanding presentation. Thank you.
Heather, can I ask a quick question since we have a minute?
Yeah, go for it.
Can you comment on the database that you use to collect all the matrix? Is it a homegrown, like a PMH developed database, or is it a web-based tool application that other sites can also purchase?
Okay, so a great question, Antella. So we started, it is homegrown because we started the database in 2005. And it started very simple, okay, where there was like one screen, basic background information about our trials. And again, they would link the patients, okay. Since that time, we still have that database sitting in the middle, but our patients are no longer linked to it. They're actually entered directly into Epic. And for critical data fields that I know I want to be able to report on at the per patient level, we worked with Epic during Go Live to build out specific fields in the study maintenance area so that we can track things like department, phase, sponsor, academic versus not. So we do have the ability to do some of that reporting out of Epic, even in the absence of our larger database. Okay. That larger database is similar to like a CTMS. So a lot of the things that are in there should also be available in a CTMS if you're using one. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah, that was great. Thanks again. Great
No problem.
presentation, and congrats to you and the program for setting all of this up. This is great.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know, Renuka, like CTO, you guys have Edge, right? That you guys support for select sites, or I guess it's through 3CTN, right?
Yeah, we don't actually manage or we're not involved in
3CTN group. Okay.
maybe.
Yeah, so I think that's something like some groups use Edge and there's some of the data that's in there, but we did, you know, we were a little concerned when we did the migration over to Epic because it doesn't have the same integration that we had before, but being able to work with the Epic team and have those critical fields added, you know, to the study maintenance has definitely eased some of that reporting and really helped to make sure that we're still able to do a number of the things we were doing before.